This is a special occasion, being our 7th edition of the International Conference, and I hope it is a start of great things for all of us in building the impact of geospatial technologies and space science on our continent.
It's going to be an interesting session based on the CVs and experience that these individuals have.
We want communities and societies to take ownership, and therefore we want to involve communities in building these capacities, which is critical for the space program.
The call for the link between science and policy has been very eminent. This is simply linking science and policy, generating the knowledge, and then getting it informed.
Being a UN agency, we here are all mandated to be able to support governments.
So we believe we cannot reform unless we deform the form, and that's what we are doing.
What we've been able to do with Rcmrd through the less than 2 years that we've been partners shows the amazing potential that exists in our synergies.
We believe that our future starts with geographic understanding and recognizing our world as an interdependent ecosystem that we as humans can shape with the decisions that we make.
I hope that this will provide us a platform to even form new collaborations that we can be able to leverage on, and that will be geared towards bridging the gap between science and policy.
Thank you all, and let us keep the collaborative spirit for the good of those we seek to serve.
We need to move away from data dissemination to data utilization. Congratulations on the 7th RIC conference, and we're really looking forward to the next 3 days. Thank you.
So today we are continuing with that conversation, and in terms of the sessions, the session that you're going to have now will be divided into two. So the first hour we'll have 2 keynote addresses. So we'll be looking at data platforms and how to improve data access and sharing. From the conversation yesterday, data was picked out as one of the key gaps. We say there's a lot of data, but where is that data? How can we access that data? Are there challenges around that? So we'll have that conversation today. So we'll have 2 speakers who will make their presentation or give their keynotes. The first speaker will be David Gadseden from Esri. And then we'll have the second speaker will be Amjad Abashar from UNDRL Regional Office for Africa. And then when we are done with the keynote address, then we'll proceed on to the panel session where we'll have the panel discussion on data policies, platforms, and interactions. And then we'll have a panel discussion from there. So I want to take this opportunity again to thank Rcmrd for the great job that they've done in organizing this conference. And more especially you, the participants who are here on time to have this conversation. So that we continue advancing the issue that we're discussing during this conference. And what is the theme of this conference? I hope it is. I was hoping it is not there so that I challenge you, but the theme of this conference is Next Level Space 2 Community. So I want to invite the first keynote speaker, who will share a bit more on what they are doing at Esri, Mr. David Gadseden. I hope I've not butchered your name too much. Karibu. Yes, let him give him a hearty clap so that he has energy to do the presentation.
Asante.
Please.
Let me just get connected here. If you've seen an Esri presentation, I'm sure many of you have, we make a lot of use of graphics and PowerPoint. So I'd be happy just to stand here and speak to you, but I hope I can illustrate some of the concepts that I hope to get across. Thank you all for being here. This is an incredible opportunity. It's a learning opportunity. You're all coming from many different places. Clearly some very senior executives in the room, many of you well-established professionals and practitioners in geospatial technologies, and some of you just getting started. And so I'll be shaping my comments today to try to be relevant to each and every one of you. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity. I'm David Gadsden. I'm coming from Redlands, California. That's where Esri was founded in 1969. For the last 53, approaching 54 years. The only thing that Esri has done is focused on building geographic information systems technology. So we've been focused on unlocking the power of technology with the guidance of geography, with the organizational framework of space, well organized, and relationships in space. That allows us to build different types of systems that are touching almost every industry in the world. I'll talk a little bit about my work in the field of conservation, environmental protection, and habitat work, but really this talk is on theme about how do we better improve access to geospatial data. Use, effective use. There was a very rich conversation yesterday about geospatial technologies helping advise policy decisions to make better decisions in a more informed way. So how can the tech contribute to that? And if the tech is locked up, if the data is locked up, it makes that task very difficult. So I'll be sharing today some of the approaches that Esri has taken to unlock and make accessible meaningful data through powerful geospatial tools to help make better decisions. Now, some of this is by example. Esri now serves over 10 million people in the world. So think about that. 10 million people are interacting with our technology and applications and on their phones, on websites. They're getting reports to make decisions. So this is a vast user community. You can see on the left of this slide, some of the breakdowns of who those users are, what types of organizational constructs those are. But I would argue that within that massive user community are many individual communities that focus on specific industries. So Esri is only about 10,000 employees. So I want you to just reflect on the math of an organization of 10,000 employees serving a user community of 10 million. How would you approach that? Can you have an intimate relationship with 10 million customers? Absolutely not. So what we do is we invest in communities. We invest in communities of practice around different themes. So the water resources community has events. They have publications. They have training. We help at those events bring the best examples of the work together so they can share with one another best practices. We then have a small water resources team that builds useful and repeatable tools that can help GIS be relevant at scale across that community. So I'm laying out some themes here, right? How do you support communities? And I'll talk about different types of communities. This is sort of an industry definition by which the way that Esri serves the world is by not only making core technology, but serving the primary communities of practice that are utilizing these tools. Now, the reason that approach is critical is because GIS is not getting any less complicated or complex. It's also increasingly powerful, right? So to stay on top, to stay up to date on the rapid innovation in this field requires investment. And we very much appreciate that's asking a lot. It's asking a lot because our software development machine, now 54 years running, is very efficient. It's moving forward with IT as IT advances. So as new concepts enter the realm of information technology, Esri's engineers are then adopting and adapting how we can take advantage of those new innovations. That may be sensor technology. It may be Internet of Things technology. It might be artificial intelligence and AI, right? So because of that powerhouse of engineering and software development that's serving a massive global community, it's a challenge to keep up. So how do we do that? Again, by supporting specific communities. Now, while the underlying technology continues to become more powerful and more effective, handling bigger and bigger data sets, being more and more integrated, it's also more accessible than it's ever been before. And that's through apps. Being able to take potentially complex data sets, integration of many different data feeds coming from different sources, and to build something useful for managers in the field or business managers back in the office through information products like dashboards, which are dynamic and allow them to explore things that seem to be a little bit out of line, right? That's a new paradigm for GIS. Now, some of the elders in the room will remember that GIS was very much a powerful piece of software back in the day, and if you didn't have training and know how to run it, you were not going to get very far. And that wasn't that long ago. I've been at this now for 30 years. That's where I began in my career, right? What's changed is that this integration of cloud services and well-articulated data feeds, because of the organization of geography, are able now to come together in a very rapid and efficient way. So ArcGIS and our move into more of geospatial infrastructure for the entire world that we're serving has really unlocked the ability to abstract out focused and useful information products in the form of apps. So if you're not, this sort of transition I'm describing of going from heavy software with a lot of training, one or two GIS people being, the organization being reliant on them to produce a map. Like, we are far beyond that paradigm now. So if you're not thinking of GIS as an integrated and operational and live system, you're a little bit behind, and it's important that you invest in catching up. Because today GIS runs the world, and it runs the world not through PDF maps that are updated once a week or once a month. It's an integrated live dynamic system, and it's making a difference across countless industries. The other impact of that technology, the evolution of that technology, is that it's no longer relevant to just the software people or just the people looking at that paper map. It's actually relevant to collaboration across an entire organization, so that different business units are playing against a common sheet of music. Different departments don't have a different view of what's going on, right? There's a common view. The most important things to our organization, whether those are places that we own or manage or assets that are moving, everyone has a consistent view of where those things are. And that's a critical first step to getting organized and enabling a digital transformation of your business or your agency. There are many examples. Again, I work in conservation. So there's a major, you may have heard of the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, or BirdLife International, which works a lot in Africa. In the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas, there's an organization called the Audubon Society, the National Audubon Society. And they're a very large nonprofit focused specifically on birds and bird habitats. So about 10 years ago, they went through a digital transformation to embrace GIS. And where they started, there were many chapters, many volunteers, thousands of them, and they all had a different view of what they were working on, because the critical data for their organization lived in different people's notebooks or in PowerPoint presentations where people had sketched maps. They didn't know where the important bird areas were, even though they had a science team that was defining that for the entire organization. There wasn't access to that information. So they were disorganized. So at times they were in conflict with each other, right? Because they had a different visual picture of what they were actually working on. So the first thing that Audubon did as part of their digital transformation was to say, we're going to implement GIS technology to have one data feed for our important bird areas, and everyone is going to see it. And that became a foundational layer. And they added additional foundational layers. And even though each chapter in this very large organization was continuing to develop their own approaches to solving their local problems, they weren't arguing over the fundamental baseline data. So what I want you to think about is, what is the fundamental baseline data for your organizations? How is it managed? How is it shared? Is it someone you need to go ask for that information? Because if that's the case, then there's a terrific opportunity to become much more efficient by embracing more of a community approach to your GIS information. So again, where we are today is GIS is not only relevant to individuals that are highly trained or across organizations, increasingly it's relevant across communities. Now, that is largely enabled through ArcGIS Online. ArcGIS Online takes many years of software development at Esri and it moves it into a cloud computing environment that is scalable, and it is scaled now to reach 10 million people around the world. So it can expand and contract as needed, right, for the needs of your organization. Now, there's a lot of learning that's left to pursue about how cloud computing is a greater efficiency, how it's in many cases more secure than enterprise technology that you would install and manage within your organizations. But what we're seeing is a massive adoption of ArcGIS Online. In my advocacy for conservation, I would say I would exclusively start with ArcGIS Online everywhere where you even intermittently have an internet connection. I would not begin with software and a server. If you get to a place where that's needed, no problem. The technology can scale in that manner to get you that infrastructure within your organization. But as far as the use and efficiency of starting with the cloud, that can happen very quickly. Now, our users have embraced this approach because instead of installing software, looking for files, going through that old sort of getting started process, you can log in and suddenly have access to a massive amount of information that you can use to build your own maps and bring your data into. It's working very well to the extent that our users have shared over 65 million items that they're managing in ArcGIS Online. So 65 million items. There was just I was just looking at some of the dashboards we look at internally for the growth of this system, and this is something like 10,000 new items a day that are being managed and added to ArcGIS Online. Now, you decide whether that information is private to you, is shared with some of your colleagues, is shared within your organization, or it's made public. And that's this graph off to the left here. So a little bit difficult to read, but 21% of the data that's stored in ArcGIS Online out of somewhere around 65 million items. That 65 million items is a little bit of a dated number now. We could be approaching 70 or even 80 million items at this point. So that's 13 to 15 million items, million things that you can go into ArcGIS Online today, search for and discover. So again, this talk is about how do we do better about making data available. This is an example of how Esri has embraced this cloud computing paradigm to make that a very real opportunity for you today. And there's many core capabilities, as you can see off to the right, that make ArcGIS Online more powerful, more accessible, and more effective for getting started with GIS compared to the software. The software is still very relevant for the advanced work. If you want to go hard into data science, absolutely. Learn ArcGIS Pro. It's a very powerful package. It works with many other powerful analytical packages. But if you want to get started with GIS, if you want to build an app to make your organization more effective, right? If you want to collaborate with your colleagues, if you want to integrate data feeds to get a better sense of what's going on right now from different sensors around the world and imagery around the world, absolutely, I would encourage you to start with ArcGIS Online. Now, when you have 65 million items, or at least back to the publicly shared ones, let's say 13 to 14 million, what is accurate? What's a student project and what's coming from a federal agency that you can trust as the most authoritative? It was a challenge for us early on. As we saw this content take off, Esri had to invest in developing a content, sort of a curation system to say, okay, this is the best available, and this is coming from the best available providers in the world. And we worked with those providers to document and accredit that they were the provider and it's their data, and we organized that into what's called a living atlas of the world. So that living atlas now has over 10,000, again, out of this massive number I've been referencing, of authoritative, curated, documented data sets. In some cases, in my field, they're very important layers. The World Protected Areas, the WDPA from WCMC, the World Protected Areas Database. It's out there on a website, but to allow it to participate with everything else in this catalog, it needed a little bit of help. And so our team will also help that organization to help publish and make that data scalable to be able to participate in a system that big. But when you log into ArcGIS Online and you find a layer in the Living Atlas, whether that's imagery or terrain or boundaries, you can be sure that that's the best available data for that location and that topic. Now, we also have so I'll talk a little bit more about that content in the Living Atlas. Esri builds maps of the world with our partners and with our users. And so cities, for example, that fly high-resolution satellite imagery, they invest heavily to have aircraft or drones fly this imagery. It's then got to be managed somehow. These are really big files. So if we go back to the Autobahn concept, how do you put that imagery in front of everyone that needs to use it for operations? It requires serving that imagery out. One option is to share it with Esri, and we will include it in our image map of the world. And so we can stitch together all of these high-resolution mapping projects and build an elevation service of the entire world, or a high-resolution imagery service of the entire world, or different base maps that even include the building footprints and streets for Accra, Ghana, and many cities around the world, because for those cities, it made sense for those to share those with us and allow us to host them and publish them back to the entire world. So again, on the theme of this talk, how do you improve collaboration and sharing? You build maps together. You be honest about who has the best data. You acknowledge and you don't take ownership of other people's work, right? And you stitch it together in the best available way. This is what we know today, right? And so I want to dig into that a little bit, because if your organizational approach is that this is mine and I'm going to hide it from the world because I know it's powerful, but I don't, I want to protect my organization, that inhibits you from unlocking the power of GIS and integrating technology of GIS and actually building a view of what's going on across the entire landscape, including your neighbors and your neighboring organizations, or potentially federal agencies that have other contributions to this complex world that we're living in, so you can have a better basis for your decision making. Esri does not take ownership of any data that people are storing and managing in ArcGIS, and we don't take ownership of any of the content in the Living Atlas, right? Those organizations are well represented in the documentation that we provide for each of those layers. You can go directly to the source and get to know them as the provider. If they decided they wanted to stop participating someday, that would be a disappointment for us, but they're absolutely able to back out of it. And there are other mapping approaches in the world. There are other technology companies that engage in mapping, that is the opposite of their approach. So when you store your data in their platform, that becomes their property, and you need to really carefully read the terms and conditions when you load your data into those other systems. Now we can also take the Living Atlas and we can regionalize it and make it more appropriate for geographic communities around the world. So by going in and taking these capabilities of not only the content, but specific to the continent of Africa, but learning tools and engagement tools and collaboration tools, and making it easier for you and your colleagues to actually find the best available data in the Living Atlas, but for the continent of Africa. And again, approach it not only as just data, but as community development, as geospatial community development, through a set of useful and powerful tools. That's the nature of the Africa GeoPortal, and I trust you're familiar with it. If you're not, please note the QR code off on the right here. Now, I'll warn you now that I will be flashing up some QR codes a little bit later on, so if you like to work with those, I'd keep your phone a bit handy. Now, building on top of ArcGIS Online, we actually have the ability to deploy collaborative web applications that are built for collaboration. They're actually built for collaborating across different types of organizations, including national governments all the way down into the public. And so as far as what Esri is building for technology that can contribute to better collaboration and engagement, ArcGIS Hub is specifically built for that purpose. Now, I'll go through some examples of an ArcGIS Hub, but what's interesting about these is we're moving beyond just a web application or just a mobile application that you might have on your website. It's a collection right? It's a collection of dashboards. It's a collection of tools that your users could actually visit the hub and download and go collect some data with. And when they collect that data, it updates a dashboard that everyone participating can see those things update. So think about, we're going to go out and plant trees. We're going to go out and clean the streets, right? We're going to do activities or engage in initiatives that we agree to partner on, but we're not all working for the same organization. We're nonprofits, we're government, we're citizens, right? We're academics. Like, how do you collaborate? How do you share data? How do you communicate with one another, right? How do you communicate that we're going to have an event and we're going to get together in this location on Saturday, and here's an app that we're all going to use as we go about our cleanup activity. Hub is specifically designed for that type of work. Now, here's an example of a hub that our colleagues have put together for climate change and climate data. So this is, I've already skipped past the landing page. We're now looking at some meaningful content around visualization. So you'll see some references here. Let's look at what's possible in visualizing climate. Different types of raster data, different approaches to visualizing time, getting into looking at change over long periods, looking at trends and patterns and frequency and risk. Now, that's the visualization capability. Under the learning capability of this climate hub, we then have a series of lessons and tutorials. So think about what we're doing here. We're trying to engage a user community around leveraging geospatial technologies around climate change. Very complex topic. Lots of data science and useful tools to bring forward. So the hub just gives us a framework to be able to provide this to the community, and it's available to all of you. And so any of you that would like to interact with this hub, go through those lessons. Here's an opportunity to grab your phones and get a snapshot of this QR code. I see some phones coming out, so I'm just going to hold on for a minute here. And you know, if the URL is taking a moment to pop up, grab a photograph of it, and we'll just keep kind of moving on. Okay, the other thing I really want you to be aware of is Esri's massive online and open learning courses. And so this climate, GIS for climate action in the upper right, upper right, yeah. For some reason, my right and left are getting a bit confused this morning. But this GIS for climate action is going to be really powerful. It's October 25th. Tens of thousands of people join these courses. They are free. The technology to go through them is also free. And who in this room thinks that climate change is not going to affect them in the next 2 decades? Raise your hand. Exactly. So this is a community endeavor because we are all in this together. Climate change is coming at every single one of us, right? So as geospatial professionals, you have the opportunity to get ahead of it a bit. Learn about the tools that are available. Make some useful contributions to your organizations, to your communities. Consider this part of your professional tool set as you move forward. Now, there's other really powerful MOOCs here, imagery in action, spatial data science, which continues to become increasingly powerful, and a number of them next year. Go ahead and grab your phones, and if you want to learn more about any of those freely available courses, grab a photo of that, grab the QR code. So, yeah, I mean, one of the themes that I'm picking up, because again, this isn't, I'll go back for another moment as I make this comment. This isn't a topic that I normally present on, but I've been reflecting on it as I prepared for this, is that a key part of engaging a community with this powerful technology is to simplify the experience through apps, make it easier for people to visualize it and work with it, and also training, so you're empowering that community to take advantage of these capabilities themselves. So you do see me focusing on training as I go through this. Now, in the field of conservation, part of the way that my team is supporting the global conservation community is to develop a set of training materials that are specific to the new UN Global Biodiversity Framework. So this is, has been referenced in some of the presentations yesterday. It is a new UN level commitment to how we'll measure nature through 2030. How will we manage species loss? How will we get in front of the challenges presented by invasive species? How will we set areas aside for nature to survive climate change and have an opportunity to adapt in a dramatically changing world? I will put up a QR code in just a moment, but this is just a quick flyover of the program. We've delivered one of these. You can go and visit this website. You'll see in a moment to watch the video. We've got another one coming up in September. And as you'll see, we're approaching multiple targets that are under the goals of the new Global Biodiversity Framework. I am quite confident that every one of the countries you're coming from has committed to this. How do we get there? How do you measure these? How do you monitor these various topics? That's the purpose of this program. So go ahead and grab your phones if you'd like to visit the webinar site. If you can sign up for each of them individually and then access the recordings from the previous sessions. Now, these are, the initial session was around target 3, which is 30 by 30. That is this commitment to conserve 30% of land and waters by the year 2030. That doesn't mean 30% of every country becomes a national park. It does mean that 30% of each country is managed in a nature positive fashion. Maybe it's restored in a meaningful way. Maybe it's reforested in a meaningful way, or it's supporting a new wildlife corridor, right? All of those types of areas are relevant. There's some colleagues in the room and presenting yesterday and later today from the IUCN. They're working with countries to establish those standards of how that will be measured. IUCN is a very close partner of ours. Keep an eye in this space because, again, the Global Biodiversity Framework is only 9 months old at this point. We're putting tools out to help with learning and engagement, again, in that community investment fashion. But it's going to, that work will continue to advance up to and beyond 2030. Now, I want to talk about, I've been sort of taking my own definition of community, focusing on its advanced geospatial user communities. So what about villages? Yeah. What about villages? What about small areas, right? Like actual, local communities that are responsible and challenged by their own land management? We worked with the Jane Goodall Institute to publish their book on their community level approach to conservation and improving well-being in those communities. So the title of this event, Space to the Community, this is one of the few projects that I've seen work at scale where they literally start with community engagement, where they're building maps on the ground, they're sketching on paper, they're laying down leaves to represent forests, they're doing a local zero technology community mapping activity with the communities. They then photograph that map however it was made. They get high resolution imagery from Maxar and other sources. They bring back that map back to the community, and then they start sketching and planning against a more advanced backdrop, which then leads to village use, land use plans, areas that are set aside, monitors that are monitoring forest and behavior that the village agreed to. It's a very elegant approach. It also includes many things that have nothing to do with conservation. Women's health, education, microfinance. But the outcome of the way that the Jane Goodall team works with these communities is conservation. And if you back up, or one of the outcomes, so if you back up and look at the entire landscape where this Takare method has been worked through multiple communities, you will see corridor maps where each village has set aside a bit of land to allow the chimpanzees to move from place to place. So this is very difficult work at the community level. It's, many organizations have done it in an inappropriate way or an unsustainable way for many years. In my assessment, this is one of the best approaches I've ever seen. Esri's role was to publish this book through Esri Press. We also built a set of applications that support activities within the Takare process. So this simple mapping activity I'm describing, where we're going to sit down together and build a map of what's important to us, sketching on that map by someone that's maybe on a computer as the community as the community works through the dialogue, mapping stakeholders if we're talking about setting an area aside. Now, think about this in a 30 by 30 context. If every single one of our communities is going to find 30%, it's going to get a bit complicated quite fast, right? There'll be different stakeholders with different opinions. How do you manage those stakeholders across the landscape? What their opinions are, how you visit with them, how you provide educational materials to try to find common ground. This is a set of applications for that purpose, as well as managing wildlife and nature observations within the area. Now, we have a learning template that you can follow, a tutorial that will install these apps for you within a hub. And again, the hub is the technology, the collaborative technology I mentioned earlier. What you see here is on the right, my personal ArcGIS Online organization I use for demos, and that tutorial on the left. I follow through the tutorial. I find the initiative, which is there in the catalog. I'm going to install the community-driven conservation, and I get all of those apps installed in my ArcGIS Online, and then I configure them. I make light changes, and they're ready to go. So this is our intent, is to make these tools easy and accessible, and you could apply them to many different types of activities. So if you're interested in exploring those, here's your last QR code. I am concluding. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. But this is the last resource I'll provide today. Now, thank you all. It's been such a pleasure. The second year in a row I've had an opportunity to support the RIC event, seeing the growth and the growth of the community. We're getting, God willing, COVID continues to be further in the rearview mirror, and it's wonderful to see so many of you coming from so many different countries. So thank you so much. We appreciate the opportunity to contribute.
Great presentation. Let's give him another hearty clap. So I'll take a few reactions later. So if the team that is handling the mics, you can arrange for that after you have the second presentation. But again, and I would want to get the reflection from yourselves in terms of the presentations. But for me, what I can take from that presentation is the need for data integration and the need for consolidating that data so that you're able to get insights. And that is one of the issues that always continues being a challenge across the ecosystem. David didn't share much about himself, but I read a few comments about himself. He's the Esri Director of Conservation Solutions. He's an applied geographer with more than 2 decades of experience applying GIS technology to address complex humanitarian and conservation challenges, and he shared quite a bit of that. He led to the establishment of Esri not-for-profit program, and if you want to engage more with him, and I know there is quite a big team here from Esri, please do reach out to them. If you have reactions that will not be featured in the conversation, please do engage them and see what opportunities you can derive from that engagement. So the next presentation will be from Amjad Abasha. He's the Chief Regional Office for Africa for Disaster Risk Reduction. Before joining UNISDR Regional Office for Africa, Mr. Bashir headed the organization Regional Office for Arab States in Cairo, Egypt. He began his UN career as a program officer with the UNDP Emergency Unit in Sudan, dealing with operations Lifeline Sudan in the early 1990s. I will allow him to share more about himself when he comes to the podium. We are running a bit of time. I hope when you see me standing, then it will be your cue that your time is up. Unfortunately, we have to limit the time. But karibu sana and come share your perspective. Let us welcome him with a hearty clap.
Thank you. I'm going to help you with that, yeah. Get some this side. Okay, thank you very much, moderator, and good morning, everyone. My name is Amjad. I am the head of the regional office for the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, based in Nairobi, and we cover all the work on disasters or disaster risk reduction in Africa. So I'm going to be sort of maybe shifting sort of the discussion and focusing really much more, maybe less technical, but more on the disaster risk reduction aspects of data and how we try to use it within my organization as well as with partners. But first of all, just to quickly let you know a little bit about my organization, which is the what we call, we are the custodian of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and we basically are the focal point for coordinating disaster risk reduction among the international community as well as in support of member states. How we do that is through, as I said, coordination, advocacy, awareness raising, information, and that includes data, campaigns, and as well as monitoring the progress that is occurring in terms of disaster risk reduction globally. In my case, it's much more focused in Africa. Our main blueprint is called the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is a member states agreed document, guidelines that were agreed in the Third World Conference in 2015, and it's a 15-year program that provides guidance to the world, I would say, to be able to implement disaster risk reduction activities around the globe. I think one of the important things what we do is in terms of campaigning and advocacy is there's the CNN effects that people talk about, in which you have a lot of information, a lot of media focusing on what happens when a disaster strikes, but very much less coverage when it comes to reducing risk and success in reducing risk. So when a disaster doesn't happen, of course, it becomes it's not really news. So one of the key, some of the key aspects of disaster risk reduction of the Sendai framework is to focus on shifting from managing disasters to managing the risks. This refers to what I was saying earlier, is less on managing response and focusing much more on reducing the risks that may occur from disaster, to prevent disasters from happening. The other aspect that I want to underline is that the Sendai framework also called upon member states to focus on preventing the creation of new risks and strengthening resilience. So sometimes bad development actually ends up creating more risks for us as we go forward. And it also extended the scope of natural disasters or natural hazards, is what I want to say, to include slow onset disasters, man-made, as well as biological hazards. It also called for ensuring that disaster risk reduction, which is essentially very much developmental in nature, is to make it coherent with the climate change agenda, the Paris Agreement, because of the nature of climate and how 90% of disasters are actually climate related. And it's also an essential part of achieving the sustainable development goals that all countries have committed to. The Sendai framework has 4 priorities for action that I wanted to mention. The first one is on understanding disaster risk. The second, focusing on having a strong disaster risk governance. The third priority on investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience. This sort of targets the private sector and ensures that private and public investments are essentially resilient and also act to reduce risk. And the fourth priority is enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and building back better. In other words, once a disaster occurs, it is also an opportunity to build back better to reduce losses should the disaster occur. The one for our purposes here, the priority that's important for our purposes here is the first one, priority one, which I'm probably relevant to many of you because it's focused on understanding disaster risk, and this is where data collection on disaster losses is important. This is where issues of GIS come in, hazard mapping coming, making available hazard data comes in, vulnerability analysis, remote sensing, and so forth comes in. For us in the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, we also have a data strategy which is based on 4 accelerators having to do with strengthening risk knowledge and evidence, generating risk to help inform risk evidence to help inform investments, scaling up prevention, and integrating disaster risk reduction with climate action. I think it's too artificial to separate them, climate risk and climate action. It's very important that we work together on this. For this to be achieved, we need good governance, and that data needs to be managed and collected, compiled across the many institutions, and hopefully also involve communities. This is a challenge that we face on a day-to-day basis, particularly in the developing world. And of course, the issue of partnerships is very important, and we need to engage to collect the data on disasters. We need to engage with a wide range of stakeholders who may possess that type of data. So what we have known so far, at least from the data that's available, is that the world is not on track to reduce risk. As the current trend continues, the climate emergency, the disaster, the number of disasters happening globally around the world is expected to increase from around 400 disasters per year in 2015, which is when the Sendai framework was adopted. Until now, it's increased from 400 to 560 disasters per year. You'll see from the graph that the majority of these are floods and storms, and of course, which underlines the climate link with disasters. We also are believing that human choices are driving vulnerability and exposure, and there are increasing losses. So this graph shows an increase of approximately 145% from an average of around 145% in economic losses. In the 90s, it was about 70 billion annual losses. Now we're talking about 170 billion in the 2010s in terms of economic losses. And this is important when it comes to, particularly in developing countries. But I have to state that the cost of, let's say, losses, infrastructure that's available in developed countries often costs more. So often our losses in Africa are more in human lives and in more in agriculture and areas of that sort. So I think we talk about economic losses when it comes to disasters, but they also fundamentally undermine the social and ecological systems that we have. So as I said, climate change is rapidly altering our understanding of risk. The number of disasters globally per year are expected to increase by 40% by 2030, droughts by 30% by 2030, and I don't have to tell you about extreme temperature events which may increase as we go forward. So there is increasing frequency, disasters are increasing in frequency, they are more intense, and it's becoming, of course, a challenge for many of us around the globe. Another thing that it's important to look at, and what we're calling now systemic risks. Systemic risks are what we call, they're cascading. When a disaster occurs, they often result in a cascading effect. They're interconnected, and we wonder how data can actually help us understand that better. So as I mentioned earlier, despite progress we're making in development, we're still creating risk through the development trajectory that we're taking in many cases. So it's very important to get an understanding of how data can actually explain to us or provide us with more information about how risk is interconnected, how one disaster can lead to another and another. The imperative, I think, strong quantitative evidence is probably needed. So going back, what is risk really? For us in the disaster risk reduction community, we don't believe there's such a thing as a natural disaster. We believe that it's a natural hazard. It's a hazard, and it's the combination of vulnerability, exposure, and the hazard that actually results in the disaster itself. So it's the choices that we make as human beings that actually can result in a disaster. A disaster in the Sahara Desert where nobody's living, and if you have an earthquake there, it's not really a disaster, but in a community of many with a high population, when an earthquake strikes there, that's when the disaster is identified. So how are we going to measure risk? We need to design systems which factor in the workings of the human mind. You know, we are humans, we have our faults, and so it's very important to recognize as we are designing systems that are resilient, to recognize the role of people's perceptions of risk. How do they see risk? What kind of biases do they have? And make sure that we close that gap between the reality and the biases of the human mind. There's also importance to recognize the value of risk analytics as a tool that can help us understand, strengthen the evidence we have, and also take the program if that is necessary to become more resilient. There's also discussions importance about reworking the financial system. This refers to the much to the private sector, but also to understand the real costs of risks, particularly the long-term risk, and how and the importance of reworking investments, looking at insurance systems to incentivize risk reduction. There are many ways of doing that, but I will not get into it right now. What kind of data and analysis is required to generate risk information? There's a number of things that we're doing in UNDRR that are related to data collection. I mentioned earlier on that there's the Sendai framework. The Sendai framework has an online monitoring to monitor the progress that is being made by member states based on 7 targets related to losses in terms of number of people affected, economic losses, disaster risk reduction policies, and so on, which are being reported on by member states that will help them understand the progress they're making. Ideally, this is supposed to be based on disaster losses, damage, tracking of disaster losses at the national level, and which is quite important for us. Now, when we talk about disasters in our community of disaster data, in our community of disaster risk managers, is to ensure that the data is disaggregated, it's inclusive, that everybody has equal access to it, it is transparent, open data, as I think we call it, and hopefully innovative in terms of technology, technological innovation, and also it's relevant and makes sense to the decision makers. One of the things that we're doing right now is working with the World Meteorological Organization as well as UNDP to develop a new model for losses and damage tracking. I won't bore you with this part here, but it's based on the fact that we have established some years ago something called the disinventory, disaster loss inventory. In Africa, there are 32 countries who have this software. It's that little box on the top left with the maps. This is basically allows national governments to collect disaster loss data going back historically to about maybe 30 years or so, depending on what's available. I have seen some going up to the late 1800s. And this allows countries to understand a little bit where the losses are, where the vulnerabilities are. There's some challenges when it comes to disaster loss data collection. And a lot of times, unfortunately, in Africa, we actually have to refer to the international databases that are out there, European or American, and use them to actually calculate our losses. Well, what that does is it does not take into account the recurring extensive disasters, meaning the disasters that are small but occur frequently, and that causes a lot of losses at the community level, a lot of losses on livelihood, and we're not accounting for that. We did a study some time ago, and we found that these international databases sometimes are what's the word? Are unable to calculate, they miss the calculation by 60%. So sometimes 60% of what's reported at the national community level in terms of disaster losses is not reflected in the international databases. Another area of work that we're doing, what we're calling the risk information exchange. This is now being developed in a number of countries, in South Sudan, if I recall, Eswatini, and it's basically a living repository, open source data that brings together regional, national risk information and promotes the use of a common taxonomy for risk-based and standardized hazard information. The idea is to really try to harmonize information, make it available in one place, and right now it's focusing much more on the national level, so national governments work together to be able to, we work with the national government to be able to collect that data. It's from different sources, from the UN system, and what's available out there publicly. Before I end, I just wanted to touch base on a very important process, the process that is happening these days, which is very much reliant on data and information, and it's the development, what we're calling the Africa Multi-Hazard Early Warning Systems. It's a framework that is now led to the establishment of a number of early warning situation centers around Africa. First of all, in Africa, in the African Union, here in Nairobi at the IGAD Climate Center, as well as in ECOWAS and a number of other sub-regions. This is critical because it's part of the Secretary General's Early Warning for All initiative to make sure that early warning reaches all, end-to-end early warning, and that needs a lot of data to be collected to be able to, and disseminated to be able to understand and strengthen the early warning systems we have. The reason behind this is that a recent study conducted by UNDRR and World WMO showed that there is a lack of coverage for early warning, particularly in Africa, and this is countries reporting by themselves that only 40% of countries have functional early warning systems in Africa, and this is actually, when you dig deeper, it's not even, it's only on the surface. When you dig deeper, there's a lot of issues missing when it comes to the functionality of the early warning systems. For example, the inability of the information, the challenges in having the information reach those who most need it when a disaster strikes. So this early warning for all initiative has also 4 pillars, and I think for our purposes here, well, the pillar 1 is the one on disaster risk knowledge, which is where all the information needs to be collected. The systematic, the need to collect the data is very important. It's the backbone of this. And of course, pillar 2 deals with the detection, observation, monitoring, and analyzing and forecasting hazards. Pillar 3 is about the dissemination and communication. Different agencies are working together as partners based on their comparative advantage to ensure that these early warning systems are functional in Africa. And the idea is by 2027, all the world is covered for early warning systems. A very ambitious from the Secretary General. And the fourth pillar has to do with preparedness and response, because early warning helps you having all the data and all the information will allow us to prepare and respond better to disasters. So I think just to end here, and when we look at research institution, when it comes to disaster risk reduction, a couple of things that would be useful for our organization and many of ours is to find innovative ways to identify, collect, and use the relevant data that's out there. And I'm speaking from a selfish perspective in terms of disaster risk reduction. The importance of developing innovative methodologies for risk assessments, for modeling, for exploring multi-hazard and systemic linkages and systemic linkages to disaster risk reduction. This refers to the issue of cascading risk I mentioned earlier, and what we're calling systemic risk. Taking advantage of the academic culture to think beyond the box, bring innovative ideas. We always welcome those. Disseminate and communicate disaster knowledge in a form relevant to decision makers. This is important for us who are more connected to the policymakers and the decision makers, be they at government or regional level. Sometimes the data has to be made, I don't know if the word is simple, but certainly usable and easily understood by the decision makers in order to take action when it comes, at least from the disaster risk management perspective. And finally, engage. It's very important to collaborate, have partnerships, DR networking with science, research, academia, civil society, and policymakers. We are actually now engaged in collaborating with this, with the Rcmrd on a number of projects, which we're very proud of across Africa of this issue. So we look forward to working with them further. And of course, having data practitioners, data expert engage in regional and global debates to help inform policy making at different scales, which often lacks this strong data and information that they need and evidence to be able to make the right decisions. I thank you very much for the opportunity, and it's a pleasure and honor for me to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bashar. Can we give him another hearty clap? I see a lot of empty spaces on this end. If you want to move seats, the dignitaries that have joined us, please feel free to take your seats on the front row. Interesting perspectives we've heard from one presenter who was presenting for us the tools, and one presenter who was sharing about the applications. And I wanted to take reactions or comments, not questions, from the audience. And given that we have a youthful audience, I'm expecting that they will be the ones that, because they are youthful, they will be the first ones to pick their hands up and share their thoughts from their youthful perspective. Any immediate, there's a mic that is available. This is a conversation. It's not a lecture. Still no volunteers. It has to be a conversation. So we'll only move when you have contributions. So I'll wait for someone to offer. Yes, thank you. There is a contribution. Thank you for volunteering to enable us have this conversation. And you see, when sometimes, please go ahead.
Check. Thank you. Habari zenu. Joel Kitutu is my name. I'm from Uganda. So I'm from Uganda Red Cross Society. I work closely with the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent, and also ICRC, and also the UN bodies on disaster risk reduction. I'm an emergency preparedness and response manager at Uganda Red Cross Society. So what is said here resonates well with the work that I do, the development of risk dashboards and the development of impact-based forecasting models. And I'm glad that the previous presenter has elaborately pointed out opportune areas where we can do more from the science side, but also from the policy. So what I would like to add as a comment is that yes, there is a lot of room and space for us to do more, but what I pick from his presentation and also relating to the theme of this international conference, Space to Community, is the community involvement. We talk about something, maybe I came late, I did not hear about it, indigenous knowledge, local knowledge in forecasting. We collect a lot of data. We put it on the Deciventer in Uganda. Uganda is one of the countries where we ably use the Deciventer. I'm glad that we are talking about the RICS, the other platform. But the question is, where is the community voice? Where is this indigenous knowledge, local knowledge? How does it come into this forecasting? We can do a lot more from the science end to see how we can integrate this kind of knowledge, especially in forecasting, to help us to improve some of these models we are talking about. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your intervention. Let's give him a clap. And I'm looking now at the second hand. There's a second hand here. And and keep it short. I'm hoping the youths in this community will volunteer their voice. Yeah, we have one. So if you take those two, then we'll move to the panel conversation.
Thank you very much, moderator. My name is Joseph Matere, and I wanted just to put a comment on the second presenter, Amjad. I think that's a very good presentation. What I would suggest also is that there are many innovative initiatives that are being done regionally, but again, they have not had time to kind of synergize. For instance, we have drought as a major issue here in Kenya with serious losses, but we have initiatives that are actually going on, like the early warning, early action. FAO is doing an initiative called PLUS, Predictive Livestock Early Warning System, that includes modeling, how the modeling of how livestock consume vegetation. There is also hydrological modeling and also GIS modeling using satellites. But this has not been integrated very well. And I think, Amjad, if you can visit, I'm no longer working there, but I used to work there, I've retired. But that is an initiative that can also assist inform policy in terms of releasing resources during emergencies. It's already existing, they're already doing an initiative, and I think synergy between what UNDRR are doing with the food security team will bring about a win-win situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's give him a clap. Again, I know they are currently, I think the UN is working towards a program they're calling UN Kenya, where they're trying to consolidate those efforts. But it's important that we try and synergize those programs so that we have more impact, especially on the ground. And there was a young man here who has offered to represent the, in front here, if you can stand so that he can see. Okay.
All right, thank you so much. My name is McDonald Chifundo Nyoni. I'm coming from Malawi. Yeah, I've been joined by the Principal Secretary, Mr. Dave Chilonga, the Surveyor General, I think he's somewhere, and some other colleagues. I'm here to do a poster presentation. So my presentation is about determining the extent of disaster risk areas. In Malawi, March 2023, we were hit by Tropical Cyclone Freddy. Maybe you heard about it. It hit most of the countries, most of the districts in the southern region. So I just want to comment mostly about the previous presenter, that I like much about the Sendai framework, because it is now talking about disaster risk reduction and how we can manage the risk, which I think if I had learned about it earlier, I would have included it in my abstract. So what I like most is like what my abstract is talking about. Firstly, I've talked about the modeling, the GIS and all that. But in the conclusion, I've mentioned about there is need for resettlement. I'm an urban planner by profession, so there are two results there. It's either you are resettling the people to another place that is not prone to disaster, then you need to, when you're resettling, you look to look into all those urban planning technicalities that we look into, because they are maybe poor people, you cannot just place them anywhere. Alternatively, you can just develop strategies. Resilience, SDG 11 talks about resilience. So here the resilience is now, how do you plan for that? Do you put the buffer zones, the strategies, and also the implementations that is there? So I just like it because it's in line with what I'm doing. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Let's give him a hearty clap as well. Thank you for your contribution. Hopefully next time we, again, for representing Malawi, I hope the Kenyan youth will get inspired in the next conversations. We now want to move on to the next panel discussion, and we'll have 5 panelists, and I will invite them on stage. As I read your bio, you can join us starting from that end. Dr. Michael Kiza, who is the Deputy Director, Nile Basin Institute Secretariat. He's the Deputy Director, Deputy Executive Director, Nile Basin Initiative Secretariat, and head of the Basin-wide program. He's responsible for coordinating projects and programs to ensure continuous, sustainable, and effective, efficient implementation to enhance the development of the basin as an engine of development. So, karibu, Dr. Kiza. Then we have Dr. Samuel Mesele, soil expert with the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture. I'm told he's not with us now. So I want to invite Mr. Patrick Murunga, Assistant Director, Research and Mapping at Regional Center on Groundwater Resources. Patrick has a strong professional background as an experienced geologist and water resources management expert. Karibu Bwana Murunga. Then we have Madam Phoebe Aduo, who is the point of contact AfriGeo. She has a background in climate change adaptation, geospatial engineering. She supports the Geo Secretariat based at the Rcmrd, and she's the point of contact. Karibu, my sister Phoebe. And then we have Toshane. This one I will need to take lessons on how to read. Monyane, but we call him Toshane. He's a strategic manager to the CEO from Samsung. He has over 15 years professional experience as the strategic project, business advisory, communications, and business development and leadership with the private sector companies and public sector organizations. Toshane, karibu. I hope you've learned a bit of Swahili. So we will move the conversation to the panel, and let us give them a hearty clap as we welcome to this conversation. And we'll be taking questions and reactions from the floor, so the people handling the mics, please have a roving mic available. Thank you. So thank you again. So this panel discussion is looking at the interface between data, policies, platform, and the conversation that we've also been having in terms of where is the data. The last presentation indicated the world is not on track to reducing risk, amongst other applications. So we have a team here that will share a bit more, and I want first invite them to share in 2 or 3 minutes, and I will intervene if it goes beyond that, to share more about what their agencies are doing in their particular sector. I will begin from this end, going to the other end.
Thank you very much, moderator. DG, all honorable guests, good morning. My name is Ntoshani Mohlamunyani, very easy name. Before I start to go into the introduction, as mentioned, I'm with the South African National Space Agency, and today it is Women's Day in South Africa, and I'd like to take this moment to acknowledge and pay tribute to all the women in this venue and across the African continent, because the role of women is beyond just, as we know, in the household, but right now, even my observation is in this particular venue, I observe there may actually be more women in this venue than there are men. So, round of applause for all the women. So yesterday, my CEO did go into a lot of detail in terms of what the South African National Space Agency is doing. So what I will be giving you a brief introduction of is focusing more particularly on Digital Earth South Africa, because I think that is more related to the topic of this morning. So us as SANSA, in partnership with strategic partners such as the South African Radio Astronomy Observatory, or SARAO, launched the Digital Earth South Africa last year, October, on the 28th of October in 2022. And of course, as SANSA, we are a custodian of decadal records of high-resolution imagery of South Africa in analysis-ready data, or ARD. And we're doing this conforming to the highest industry standards, and of course ensuring that for geometric as well as radiometric accuracy, as well as atmospheric correction. Now this reminds me of what the person said yesterday with regards to jargon and everything like that. So excuse the, the geometries and all of that. So Digital Earth South Africa really is a technology that translates over 30 years of archived Earth observation satellite imagery. And we do this in newly acquired, in over 1.2 million square kilometer of the country, as well as, of course, the SADC region and other African countries. Now, Digital Earth South Africa actually allows users to actually leverage the full geographic data analysis capabilities of Python using Jupyter Hub computing framework. Now, this is a very important and a very powerful tool, because I think, without going into a lot of details, because I know I've got 3 minutes, it just really goes to demonstrate that we've invested a lot in Digital Earth South Africa as a tool that can be accessed free of charge, just to ensure that we do grant access to the data that's available in order for the community. I mean, the whole point really is about investing in this particular capability, which goes a very long way in ensuring that we contribute the little that we can as South Africa to the whole point of data sharing across the continent, and most importantly, as we can all appreciate, the Earth observation data, which is really critical to decision makers, whether be it in government, private sector, etc. Thanks.
Yeah, let's give him a clap. Then we move on to Phoebe.
All right, so I'm going to be talking about the Rcmrd initiative, which is being hosted here in Rcmrd. So Rcmrd is the Rcmrd Secretariat. And the key role of Rcmrd is to bring together all regional partners in Earth observation who are members of Group on Earth Observation. And the idea here is to be able to work together as community, to be able to foster collaboration and also look at what are those priorities that are very key to Africa that we want to make sure that are being prioritized within Group on Earth Observation. So we do a lot of communication, a lot of ensuring that countries are able to utilize and leverage the capabilities that Earth Observation can make within their decision-making processes as our key activity. On top of that, we are also working with countries to see how they can come together to create their own national coordination mechanisms. Because in as much as we have data that is global, countries also require national data to be able to make decisions around local issues that are affecting the country. So we have been working with the Kenya Space Agency and South Africa, particularly the SAGO, that is South Africa Group on Earth Observation, to create a guidance document that can guide countries on when they want to create a coordination mechanism, how do they go about it. And I know for the conversation around spatial data infrastructure has been there for decades in this country, for instance. We're always consistently talking about it. So what we want to do is to create a value proposition where countries get to understand why do they need to make an investment in having a data sharing mechanism, and why do they need to invest in that. Because for us to be able to share data effectively, that decision needs to come from the top policy maker, because they have to put in the investment, they have to create the policies and strategy that are going to address the challenges that data sharing have. In a lot of our countries, we find that we're consistently buying the same data, yet we can always reuse that same data within different governments and different sectors. And the big idea with what we're trying to do is we want to pick up from a point of let's not recreate what already exists, but let's use what exists to add value to it and also drive innovation. Innovation is very data-driven. Data that may not be important to one institution is very valuable to another institution. And when we're able to integrate data from different sources, we create even more value. Again, this conversation requires that we bring all stakeholders on board, because data is used by multiple sectors. So we need to bring all the sectors together, see how they can be able to integrate this data and create more value out of it. On top of this, when we're doing the national coordination mechanism, it's not just about having a system in place. We also need to create structure around governance of that data. Who is going to be the custodian? We need to create mechanisms of how is this data going to be accessed and how is it going to be governed. Because not all data will be open. Some data that is only relevant for a particular ministry, and there can be several ways of centering this data. You can have one central hub, or you can have sub-sectoral hubs that are linked to one central hub. So we're having that conversation, and what we're trying to do also is to work with the best case scenario we have in Africa to provide guidance, because in as much as we have guidance that comes from Group on Earth Observation, the situation across the continent in America and Europe is not the same as the experiences we have in Africa. So we want that story being told from an African lens, where we can be able, we understand the challenges from our continent, so we want to bring that perspective. I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Phoebe. Let's give her a clap. Patrick, over to you.
Thank you. My name is Patrick Murunga. I am from the Regional Center on Groundwater Resources. Our name is fairly long, so we've just abbreviated it as RCGW. We are a state corporation under the Ministry of Water here in Kenya, and we are charged with a variety of mandate functions, which translates to our directorates. One is on research and mapping of groundwater resources, where we go out, try to map out the groundwater resources in the country, and not just where the groundwater is, but where it comes from, the recharge zones as well as the discharge zones. And we also map out the water quality issues. So the output of that directorate is to ensure that we have more maps delineating these resources, as well as reports that can inform policy and the public on where to put our money when it comes to groundwater resources. The second directorate is on capacity building, where we try our level best to create public awareness on issues of groundwater resources, so that more people, not just the professionals, but even the local people, because the resource is hidden, and therefore we'd like more people to be aware about this resource for us to be able to utilize it better. And then there is the directorate also in charge of groundwater management. That there are things that we should be able to do in the catchment, especially in the upstream, for us to be able to get the water downstream. These include things like soil and water conservation, planting of trees in the upstream to ensure that the catchment is sustainable. Lastly, we have a directorate on which helps us to ensure that we put our money in the best places. It's very expensive, capital intensive actually, to put up a groundwater project up to the tune of about $70,000. So our consultancy and outreach program is to ensure that we reduce the chances of losing that money in what we call as dry boreholes. So that is one of the things that we do. I think.
Thank you, Patrick. Dr. Kiza, over to you, and we can give him a clap as well.
Thank you very much, moderator. Good morning to you all. I'm Michael Kiza from the Nile Basin Initiative, and I'll briefly introduce Nile Basin Initiative. The Nile Basin Initiative is an intergovernmental partnership of 10 countries that share the Nile Basin. And these are Burundi, Democratic Republic of Congo, Egypt, Ethiopia, Kenya, where we are today, Rwanda, South Sudan, the Sudan, Tanzania, and Uganda. It was established in 1999, and its aim is to provide a platform for countries to consult and coordinate on the sustainable utilization of the shared Nile Basin water resources for win-win benefits. The NBI is guided by a shared vision objective which sets out ambitions of the countries to achieve sustainable socio-economic development through the equitable utilization of and benefit from the common Nile Basin water resources. Using this shared vision objective, we have programs that target areas like water security, food security, energy security, environmental conservation, and general transboundary water resources governance. The objective is really around utilizing the resources of the Nile for sustainable and equitable utilization development, for prosperity, security, and peace among the Nile Basin countries. Over the 23 years of our existence, we've achieved a number of things, but I think I'll just point out two. One is building a culture of cooperation among the countries. Before NBI, countries were always looking at each other suspiciously. They were always trying to compete, who takes the most. We've been trying to build this culture, and now it is well integrated in the region, and countries are working closely with some challenges, but this is normal. And the second one is around a knowledge base. We've built a knowledge base of information, including data, the topic of today, that countries can use in their deliberations for evidence-based planning. But I guess we are going to go into this a little bit deeper. Over to you, moderator.
Thank you, Dr. Kiza. And again, let's give him a clap as well to appreciate his participation in this panel. So one of the issues that was raised by Mr. Bashar was we are using data within the region from global data sets. Sometimes we don't have local data sets. And Phoebe mentioned the element of the coordination, the challenges within national systems when you don't have those guidelines. And I wanted to pose the question to Shannon, now that you indicated you have Digital Earth South Africa. What are the mechanisms that you put in place? What are the policies that you put in place to guide the data sharing? And when you share that, then I'll go to Kiza and then share his perspective from a regional perspective. If you can share the country perspective and then get the view from Dr. Kiza on the regional perspective.
Many thanks, Charles. From a South African perspective, because I think one thing we need to, and this I think was also emphasized yesterday, is the fact that as the South African National Space Agency, we are not able to do this by ourselves. So it really does take a collaboration, not just from us as an agency, but we work very closely with academia, we work closely with private industry, and of course, with the support of government. Because I think the mechanisms that these are that we have as a platform that can people can access. For the effectiveness of it will really only be realized in the sort of in the outputs that it can make to those that actually access the data. So what I mean is the fact that all of us are working together from a South African perspective across the different, as I said, spheres, government, private sector, etc., is really just about ensuring that the decisions that are being made, whether even by government, for example, are decisions that obviously will have an impact on private industry. It does at the same time require, if you like, new knowledge that comes from the academia side. So the mechanisms are there, but what we're also looking at is how do we ensure that we actually support decision making. The point that was alluded yesterday is something that I'd like to repeat today as well. The fact that you can have, we can have all of our data specialists that can pull together and have all the data and all the knowledge, but until that can be translated into effective decision making for government and for example even for policy makers, then the data really, or rather the mechanism would not be as effective as it should be. So I think it really is about emphasizing the point of collaboration and making sure that we don't do this by ourselves. Yes, I mentioned that it is for South Africa, but of course there's aspects obviously that can be accessed by not just South Africa, but the SADC region as well as some African countries. But it's about ensuring that continuously we're looking at the quality of the data and how that can support better decision making in order to address key societal challenges. It was mentioned by one of the speakers a few minutes ago from Malawi about the disaster that they experienced recently. Again, this is where the richness of that data can actually be found effective for the user. So that would be my response for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Shoshane. And we move over to Dr. Kiza. From a regional perspective, you mentioned about the platform. How easy is it to share data across regions or across countries?
Thank you very much, moderator. Within the context of regional cooperation, as you can imagine, when countries come together to discuss a project or any other intervention, the factual basis, the baseline is very, very crucial. The understanding of how big the resource is, what is its variability, what are the pressures, is very, very crucial. And this is, of course, supported by the data and information that you have. However, we know very well from our countries that, but within the Nile, but generally, large parts of the Nile basin are not monitored, or where they are monitored, the data is patchy and not very good. And that means that the baseline data that you have for your planning is really, really not that reliable. And that's where the whole concept of Earth observation, remote sensing, and others come in. It's something we've embraced within the Nile Basin Initiative because it increases the data and information that we have for our own planning, for project development, which is a very major part of the work that we do. And over the years, as countries have appreciated this concept, it also increases the trust in the outcomes of these assessments. So within the Nile Basin Initiative, one of the things that we had to do from the beginning was to work with the member states and build a policy guidelines and the framework within which countries are able to agree that this is our approach to the issue of data and information in addition to other factors. But of course, it's still a challenge because countries, in many of our countries, the data that they have is also considered a security issue. And sometimes even the ministries we deal with directly, the ministries of water, in some countries, they are not even the primary owners of this information. So there's always those government-related issues. But what we are seeing is that this resistance to share and share data is reducing, because as you demonstrate more and more the benefits of sharing this information, you also break the barriers that are related to that resistance to share the information, and we move forward and are able to work more closely together to be able to address the challenges, significant as they are, that we face. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kiza, and thank you for sharing that perspective. And the reflection also leads us to the initial conversation or the presentation that was the first keynote that was done in terms of how do we unlock the potential of data if it is not available. And I want to move that conversation to Patrick. Given the role of your agency in terms of mapping groundwater, do you have policies in place that will determine how information that you get from, say, when you identify locations or where you have groundwater, how is that information shared with, do you have platforms where that information can be gotten, or do you have policies that will guide in terms of the data access?
Thank you, Charles. In the water sector in Kenya, there have been reforms right from the year 2002 and the year 2016, which led to the Water Act 2016, that outlined the structure and organization of the Ministry of Water. So at the apex, we have the Ministry of Water itself, which is responsible for policy and coordination of all the agencies. And in the sector, we have, in the water sector, we have 18 agencies, which are charged with different responsibilities. But it is the ministry that is responsible for these policies. Now, these are the agencies, the 18 of them, plug into the role of the ministry to ensure that there is data that informs now the policy formulation. So for instance, for us as regional center, we have developed policy statements, which are then shared with the ministry, and then the ministry will eventually build that up into a policy. So we are working on something called the Managed Aquifer Recharge, which is an artificial groundwater recharge mechanism, because we realize that over the recent past, there's been a lot of development, especially around the cities, where we have a lot of buildings and pavements that are hampering the infiltration of groundwater into groundwater infiltrating into the aquifers. So we have to find alternatives, because we cannot stop development. We have to find alternatives of accelerating recharge into these aquifers. Now, how to do that must be informed by policy, and we have developed a policy statement together with others. Now, all the other agencies in the water sector have also been playing a role in informing the ministry on what needs to be done. But there are gaps, and thank you for asking the question. When it comes to groundwater, we have quite a variety of issues related to data. Data exists in silos with different organizations. We need to put up all this into one repository so that everybody can be able to access it. Not just the professionals, but as well the general public. If you want to do your well, you should be knowing who else around that area has a well. Do you really need to put up a well when a neighbor just 50 meters away or 100 meters away has a well? Or you can share that. So the problem is usually people do not know where these resources are. And if that information were available, if we could share the data, maybe there is a database by one of us or one of the institutions, then it would be easier for the public to be able to utilize this resource more properly. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. And I want to move the conversations to Phoebe. You mentioned the current initiative on establishing national mechanisms, or what is referred to as the national geo. And Patrick mentioned about the silos. Does that mechanism address that? What are your views based on the conversation that you're having in terms of data being available, sometimes data not being available to the people who might need to use it? And again, also based on your experience having worked at the Rcmrd, what are your thoughts with regards to data access and how that can be made better or improved in terms of sharing of that data?
So the conversation we're having with countries is that the process of data sharing has to be driven by government, because we need to have a policy and an act in place to be able to support that. So when that is at that level, it means that everybody is going to have to comply, because it is a decision that is coming from government. That makes it easier to break the silos, because when government says when we buy imagery, that has to be shared across all sectors, it makes it easier to be able to break those silos. So what we're also encouraging to people is that, you know, sometimes when you talk to the stakeholders, they tell you we put money to buy these resources. So what we're doing with the mechanism is, when you have a structure in place, it also guides on who creates what data. And that makes it easier to also resource that particular institution that is mandated to create the data, because they become the custodian of that data and everybody goes to them. So that makes it easy for other people not to spend the same resources to do that. So that is what we're trying to encourage. And again, we're also trying to make sure that people understand the value of making your data discoverable. And data discoverability is very simple. Sometimes you don't have to host your entire data online. Just saying we have this data breaks a lot of data barriers, because when people come and they want to use the data, they're not coming into a blank space. They know I need to go to Rcmrd. That already breaks a lot of challenges in terms of knowing where to get that data. The other thing it does is it makes you get the entire scope of what you don't have as a country. So those data gaps become very apparent, and when you're doing your strategy for the next 10 years, you know where to spend resources in terms of creating data that does not exist. So I think that that's how we're looking at it. And the other thing, we're trying to encourage people to also leverage the capability of citizen science. Every day, we ourselves are collecting a lot of data. The recent update on population was actually done through Facebook, just by the number of subscribers on Facebook, and that gives you a scope of how many people live within a city, and you can be able to plan for, you know, what is changing, because we cannot do any more 10-year census and make sure and rely on that to plan our cities. So look at how we can be able to leverage citizen science and break the culture of data sharing. I think a lot of time is we are more holding on to data because we think that we lose value by giving it out, but I think we stand to gain by giving out the data. Thank you.
So thank you, Phoebe, for your reactions. Again, we are saying a lot of, we're quite in agreement in terms of what we need to do with data, how we need to process it. And I want to take a few reactions. I'll take 3 reactions. They don't necessarily have to be questions from the audience. And if I can have a few hands, we'll start from this end if there is a question. And keep it short. Just say what your name is and what organization you represent, and you go directly to the comment or question. We agreed it's a conversation. We are not having a lecture. I don't see any hands. In the interest, there is a question here. So there's a lady, there's 2 ladies. So if you can have those 2 ladies, and then we move to the other end.
Okay. Hello, good morning. I'm Priscilla from Namibia, from the Ministry of Agriculture and Land Reform. My question goes to Sansa. Okay, you said the data is freely available, but I just also want to know if it is also freely downloadable. And also to Afrigeo. I know soon you'll come to Namibia, I think maybe around September. So my question is I have this problem of data sharing, especially in Africa and maybe in Namibia, and that leads to data redundancy in government, like because of the data is not so much shared, everyone to collect the data, and then that goes to data redundancy, and which is costly. Like if every government organization is collecting the same data, is data redundancy and also costly. I don't know how you come in that.
Thank you for that. If you can have the next question. And David indicated there is a lot of data. Where is this data, David? Is it only Nesri?
Good morning. My question goes to Phoebe. You mentioned about the need of having national data available to different countries. Now, I wanted to know that what are the initiatives that have been put in place to ensure that the different countries have the national data available to them so that when they need to do different analysis, they have the data available to them, they don't use the global data that is available. Thank you.
Thank you. I see a question, a hand at the end, at the back there, so if you can take those and then get reactions. I was hoping a contribution from the floor as well, from the audience as well on how we can. There's a gentleman at the back there with the hands up. And then maybe we can take one last one from the lady with the white. So please go ahead.
Good morning. My name is Ndege Oduor from Dedan Kimathi University of Technology, that is in Kenya. I do have two questions. One will go to Ms. Phoebe Oduor, and that is, she talked about the government being the initiator of data sharing and pushing it forward. My question is, what is Afrigeo doing in terms of pushing for these policies to be formulated to enhance data sharing, breaking the bias, and you know, bringing out the bureaucracy, and then trying to make that accessible? Then the second one will go to Mr. Patrick Murunga. He talked about the gaps. How do we bridge those gaps, and especially when it comes to community engagement and involvement? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for keeping your questions precise and concise. If you can have one, and then one last one from the Lydia.
Okay, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. My name is Semba J. Ronald, a student at Makerere University. My question goes to Dr. Chiza as regards data availability of river, probably discharge data and all hydrological data. It so happens that most of a good part of this data is availed by global institutions like WMO and the GDRC, but this data actually stops way back in the 1970s for most of the rivers. Should we think that the monitoring of the different hydrological variables of these rivers and different catchments stopped then, or you just stopped sharing this data with them? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Final, one question, the lady, if you can stand so that they can see you. So where is that data? Kiza, we get back to you.
Thank you very much. My name is Marceline Ojwala from the Directorate of Resource Surveys and Remote Sensing. Mine is not basically a question, but a comment to all our panelists. The discussion here is all about data, and looking at the theme of this year's RIC is how we can use this data to improve the community livelihoods. So the data that we are talking about here should be accurate, precise, and also being able to support efficient planning and decision-making purposes. And many times you find that the data is there, but then it has some issues just like it has. And then I'd also wanted to put a challenge to all of us in the house here, and more so the development partners and the resource persons, because when we are collecting this data, when we are generating this data, how do we look at the synergies? The synergies that we are talking about here, even as we wait for the government to have policies in place for data sharing, data generation, and the rest, it still boils down to us, because it is us as same people who try to reinvent the wheel instead of building synergies on what is already existing. And I believe if we are also able to respect the mandates of each and every institutions in our countries, then we'll also be addressing some of these data challenges that we are facing. Because remember one of our keynote speakers yesterday mentioned about garbage in, garbage out. And the policy makers at the end of the day, they have to make policies, whether the data is there or not, whether the data is accurate or not accurate, they will have to make policies. So the challenge is still going back to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcelina. So one of the other issues that she's raising is, what are the issues around standards? What are the issues about accuracy? There's one last question from the front here. We'll take the front. That will be at the front. So we'll take this final one because of time.
Thank you, moderator. My name is Bonolo Elizabeth Kumotaka from Botswana. I'm the former GC chairperson. I don't know whether mine is a question or what, but it's a thought that is going through my head. I thought, let me just bring it out. You know, since yesterday, we've had very good discussions from the presenter, the first presenter, the keynote address in the morning. And what I have picked is that there's a lot of expertise, knowledgeable people in this room and elsewhere in Africa. And the question that is going through my mind is, these knowledgeable people, they have this knowledge and expertise to collect data, to analyze it, and turn it into information that can be used to inform policymakers to make policies that are impactful. My experience, and I hope I'm not wrong, is that most of the time, the policies that we have are not impactful. You will have a policy this year, in the next 5 years, the next 10 years is still the same because data is missing. So what I'm asking or thinking or this thought is, what are we doing or not doing to ensure that we have policies that are informed by this data that we have so that we can make the intended impact and change in our communities? Thank you.
Thank you for that question, or that comment. And I want to extend that question to the panel. As you respond to the different issues, what are we doing or not doing right? If we can start with Kiza, and then as you share your final insights as we wrap up, you could also give your final comments as we come this side. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And I want to thank the audience for all this feedback from on what we presented. It's really very enlightening, and it points out maybe some of the issues because of time we were not able to get into. But I think it gives us as panelists an opportunity to expound on them a little further. It's true. The policies sometimes have some issues in terms of implementation, and that is a broader discussion that can be had. But I think generally in our governments and in our countries and in our organizations, the issue of monitoring sometimes is not taken very seriously. It tends to get the least budget in the departmental budget, and yet unless you're doing regular monitoring of your stations and able to collect the data, monitoring the implementation of policies or otherwise, you're not going to have enough information to be able to say whether it is performing well or not. So on my side, I think we need to emphasize in our organizations and where we make decisions the issue of not just coming up with the paperwork, that is very good paperwork in terms of policies and otherwise, but to follow up with ensuring that we are collecting the information that is necessary to be able to make better decisions, but also to be able to assess some of these initiatives that we put in place. There was a question from the student from Makerere. It's a very good question. And coming from Makerere, I taught in Makerere for about 10 years, more than 10 years. So I understand where the question is coming from. And I think what he mentions is the dilemma that we have. Because I'm sure he's talking about the hydrometeorological network in Uganda, which has challenges that are replicated around the entire continent. In Uganda, in the 1970s, upon the breakout of war and everything, collecting data from these ground stations became virtually impossible. So when you look at the data set for climate and hydrology and general water resources in Uganda, you'll find a big gap where practically the entire network collapsed, okay? Until maybe the mid-90s, when a semblance of normality came back, and some stations, not all, maybe I think about 20% of the pre-1970 stations are now being monitored. The same thing probably is happening in Sudan right now. There's no monitoring because there's war, and in other places. Kenya doesn't have a lot of this problem, but there's another angle to this problem, that funding for monitoring, practically every year it goes down. And that means that a lot of stations, monitoring stations, are getting offline in all of our countries. And this is, I think, something that is going to continue, unfortunately, into the future. The good thing is that there is the alternatives. Remote sensing is giving a very good alternative to supplement the network that we have. So while a lot of effort has to be done to make sure that the existing stations continue reporting, this broadening of the sources of data is a welcome thing, because remote sensed data is cheaper. It is sometimes it is even more reliable, because it doesn't suffer from some of the defects that other data has. So a conference like this really that is talking about data issues sharing and Earth observation as an alternative is a very good one, because it is a solution, one of the solutions to the problems that our countries have. So in my final reflections, monitoring is very crucial. Monitoring the implementation of any of the initiatives. She mentioned about policies, but even a policy, once it is enacted, we have to collect data and information about its implementation, and then maybe after 5-10 years we can be able to assess and know whether we should amend it, improve, or anything like that. But leveraging Earth observation is really, really crucial. We should embrace it. Some of us work with it almost every day, and we know the power in some of this information in terms of addressing a lot of the gaps that we have in our decision making and planning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kiza. Patrick?
Thank you so much. I like the question that was asked by Elizabeth on really whether these policies that we have in place, if there are any, if they are really having the impact that they should have. And it's good that you're wondering, like I've always been wondering as well, because the truth is, like my co-panelists has said, that sometimes these are just documents on paper. The people, the duty bearers, us, most of us from the agencies, are the ones to implement some of these things. We are the ones to synergize and bring our heads together, ensure that there is sharing where possible between the agencies, especially in respective countries. Perhaps across the border it could require more consultation, but within our countries it's possible that we can push this agenda ahead. So I think the duty is upon us, those of us who are in these agencies, to ensure that there is more sharing of this data. But I was asked a question by Odwor from Dedan Kimathi University about the gaps, if there are any gaps and how we are addressing these gaps. Yes, the answer is there are gaps. We said earlier that the data exists in silos. But even when you get to have some of this data, sometimes there are inaccuracies with the data. You try maybe to plot the data in a GIS system and you realize that they are inaccurate, they are plotting in another country just because someone made mistakes in the coordinates. And therefore the data goes to a different place, and therefore what I'm trying to say is that there is need for us to validate the data that exists. So besides someone having the data, we have to check and ensure that there is ground truth to the data. Also, when we have tools like remote sensing and GIS, there is the problem that these tools, especially for those of us in the groundwater sector, we have a satellite called GRESS. Very useful, it can give you time series data, but it has a very big limitation, and that is the issue of scale. It can only give you large scale data, and therefore that cannot be very useful when you're trying to site a borehole for a community or a water project for a very small place. The data is reliable, yes, but it only has that particular limitation. Now, groundwater, which is where I come from, is unseen. The only thing that will make this resource seen is data. And I'm happy that at this conference we are discussing data. What should we do to ensure that this data is available for us to be able to see this unseen resource? Because a place like Nairobi here, we have been over-abstracting. There are so many boreholes in Nairobi, and everybody's pumping out. The net effect is that as we over-abstract, those voids that used to have water now have no water, and the overbearing weight of the buildings in the city create what we call a subsidence. So they take up that space, and we end up with lowering of elevations in the city. That is something that is dangerous, of course, because we are very close to the Rift Valley and other tectonic plates. We are likely to have more problems if some of this is not addressed. Now, the only way to do that is to ensure that there is more data and there is sharing between the agencies.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry to, on the interest of time, I know we are standing between people and having their tea. So Phoebe, over to you. And thank you, Patrick, for bringing out that issue on water abstraction.
Okay, thank you. I think I had a couple of questions. I will start with the one for Namibia. So we're having the AfriGeo Symposium taking place from 18th to 23rd of September. That's next month. And you're all welcome to join. It's really a forum for us to be able to engage and share what each other is doing, because if we don't engage and get to know what the other person has, then we won't know what exists. So you're most welcome to be part of that. So in the particular case of the issue on data redundancy, I think it's very critical to have this kind of engagements, because if you do not communicate as sectors and get to know what does institution A versus B has, you're not going to know what data exists. So that is a good starting point to create communities of practice within your country and use these to be platforms of engaging and bring it to a national level where you're all bringing all the sectors together to engage even more. So I think I would respond to that as such. On the issue of what we're doing in terms of supporting countries for national data engagement. So GEO itself has a data sharing mechanism through the GEO's system of system, and this is open for everybody who wants to share data. The limitations that the GEO system has are currently being addressed to improve on that particular infrastructure. And on top of that, we have the GEO Knowledge Hub that also enables you to share data, to share scripts, to share really all knowledge systems that you have. Because the idea with the GEO Knowledge Hub is to have a whole package of data sharing, which is very important. The other thing is, from our level of partners, we know which partners are right to support what challenge. So whether it is setting up an SDI, we can be able to link you with the right partners to support you as a country on what is required in place. On the issue of what Maslin was talking about, I think we need to keep having these conversations relating to data standards in how data is being collected and how that is being shared. That is quite important because that forms a system of data sharing. So you must have the whole package being addressed. The other element that is often forgotten is sharing also comes with infrastructure. You must have an end-to-end mechanism of how that data is going to be shared. And the one, I'd say, important element we forget is something as simple as internet. We make an assumption that countries have the same capability to access data from point A to B. So when you're not addressing the challenges related to technology, looking at the whole spectrum of how do I get this data from one end to another, and when it gets to that person, do they have the resources to actually access that data? So you have to do it from a multi-sectoral perspective, make sure you're sealing all the loops, making sure your infrastructure is in place to enable data sharing to take place. Otherwise, you can have a great system that nobody else can be able to access. I think in the last comment that Bonolo made, I would want to say that it's very challenging to make policies when it's not evidence-based, because at the end of the day, a decision will have to be made. So if this is not backed up by data, that is where we end up with challenges of it's not impactful. But the other thing that we also need to consider is the silos have to be broken, because we are in an environment now where climate change is an issue. The challenges that society is getting are actually coming all together at the same time. Nobody knew pandemic would come, and it came in spite of all the challenges that we already have. So we have to look forward and also look at mechanisms of being driven by forward-looking early warning systems where we can already foresee what is going to happen and use that to be able to drive our policies. So in my last comment, I think I want to indicate that we need to be also part of the change. We come to RIC, do we communicate back the lessons we've learned from RIC? Let's do that in our institutions, and also where we have seen country institution has a very good system and it's working and it's giving them the information that we ourselves can be able to leverage. Let's use that. So let's make those connections where we need to make them and take them back home. And lastly, I want to also talk to the ministers in this forum that we have the Ministerial Summit for Geo that is coming up 6th to 10th of November. It's a very important forum because we need people at that level to understand the value they can be able to drive from Geo and use this to make those policies and those decisions that need to be made. Thank you.
Thank you, Phoebe. You overdid the 2 minutes, but again, thank you for the great insights. And I want to welcome Toshane to share his final remarks.
Right. Thank you very much. Just quickly to respond to Bonolo's point, in my opinion, a couple of things. I think number one, there has to be an appreciation that policy evolves. COVID-19 was a classical example of how do we evolve policy to speak to the issue that we are facing right there and then. And perhaps sometimes the reason there isn't that much impact could be perhaps an unrealistic goal setting in terms of what is it that we're trying to address with the policy. And of course, as it was mentioned as well, it is important to have the political backing. I mean, whether we like it or not, the reality is we do require the support and the sponsorship of policymakers. And I think the last one would then be looking at the issue of perhaps sometimes there's a bit of a neglect to the beneficiaries of the policy in question. I just give a quick example that, for example, in South Africa, we have a mantra that goes, the government mantra, which is Batho Pele. And that means people first. So which means at the center of any policy that is being made, the needs of the citizens and the people of South Africa must be put first. So sometimes perhaps the reason there isn't that much impact is perhaps there's a bit of a neglect on the issue of who the target beneficiaries are for the policy in question. Just briefly to respond to the question from my colleague from Namibia is, yes, it is at no cost, and this really is to promote the access to satellite data acquisition through single license and multi-user licensing, which means you have a single license whereby multiple people can have access to that. That promotes data sharing, and at the same time also help us to build capacity. So perhaps just to give one final example is, from a South African perspective, we have got the oceans information systems as oceans. I must actually just get this right because it's quite a mouthful. OSIMS is the abbreviation. So what that actually seeks to do is to provide decision support for effective governance of South Africa's coastal area. So South Africa's got over 3,500 kilometers of coastal area. Now, of course, you can imagine that alone is a lot of area, but what that means is also is a lot of data for us to actually be able to provide to the South African government. And of course, not just to provide the data, because I think at the end of it all, the reason we're trying to promote data sharing, the reason we're trying to ensure that we make the most of our data is to ultimately make sure that we can actually have an impact in terms of our economies as nations and as a continent. Now, the reason I'm using the coastal area example is, as you can imagine, Blue Ocean's economy on the African continent has not even been tapped into perhaps even 20% of what it can offer. Now, can you just imagine if all that, through data, through evidence, we can actually be able to get our ministers, get our governments to really be able to look at the value and the impact that the data that we can actually provide to them can help inform policy, can actually go a very long way in getting Africa and Africans to really benefit from the endless opportunities that are literally laying in the seas that are surrounding the continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We can give the panel a round of applause. As I conclude, the key issues that have been picked out is data. And more importantly, as Tosh was concluding, he indicated putting the people at the center of solutions or developing whatever interventions they need to be. Data is important, infrastructure is important, sharing of that data is at the center of it. And I want to again thank the team for having shared their insights and also giving new perspectives. We said this is the beginning of the conversations. The challenge that we're being asked is, how do we move this conversation beyond this venue? Is it an annual event that we do and then we forget about that? Or are we going to have more continued conversation as we go along? Let us give the team another applause as they exit the stage, and I want to welcome Mr. Dude to take over the floor and give guidance. David.
Thank you so much, Charles, and your team for that insightful session. I think there's no need of emphasizing any other item from the discussions that have been given, other than to say when it comes to policy, that particular document is always living. We may put it in the shelf, it may stay up to around 100 years, but when there is need for that particular document to be activated, then the policy will come up and it will still continue to live. And for that, I'd like to, please, let's have another round of applause for Mr. Charles and his team. Thank you so much. I have a few announcements to make of the direction that we'll take immediately after this particular session, and the first one will be for the guys who would like to still have a look at the booths. They're still open all the way to the end of the day today. So please take your time, go through, get to see what some of our partners are doing. It's part of the learning activity that we're currently doing and supporting the partners as well. Our tea, we have 2 stations for tea. So we have this particular one, and for our partners, you can either maybe join this particular area, or you can visit your holding rooms. You'll still be served with the same. We have washrooms on this other side. Those are mobile e-toilets. Okay, not e-toilets. Okay. Maybe we develop that policy. We have washrooms on this side. Please, mobile toilets behind us. Please visit them to relieve yourself. For the breakout rooms, yesterday we had a little bit of a mix-up. The rooms are still the same. For the guys who will be having discussions around land, please, you will remain here. For the guys who are interested in innovations and data, we have the room on the second floor. For the guys who are interested in biodiversity and blue economy, we have the conference room in the complex as well. The one on the other side, RCTI, is for agriculture and food security. So based on your interest, you are free to visit any, have a look and enjoy the sessions. Immediately after our tea will be having place by Caspar Kundat, we'll be having a demonstration here. So let's convene back here for that particular presentation. It's one interesting one that I hope Caspar will be able to deliver. For our lunches, we have 2 places again. One will be at the pergola for the dignitaries, and the rest of the team will be having our lunch in the big tent on the other side. I know what you're waiting for. We'll be having a cocktail later in the evening. Of course, through the DG and all the dignitaries, they've told me to invite you. So please, you're welcome for that evening to continue with the discussions about policy and how to make our living document even better. And lastly, we have a bunch of